Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horn. I hope you're enjoying the summer weather and are finding some time for rest and relaxation. Over the next few weeks, I'll be replaying some of our most popular episodes, as I also take some time off for vacation. Whether you've already heard these episodes or are just listening to them for the first time, I hope you enjoy. Welcome to Just One Q. I'm Dr. Melissa Horn, a diversity, equity, and inclusion advocate. In this podcast, I chat with industry experts and thought leaders about the latest trends related to diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace. Each episode, I ask one burning question tied to current events. Our goal is to leave you with the tools you need to drive change in your own life, both personally and professionally. Much has been written in the past 18 months about the impact that COVID-19 and the resulting pandemic has had on women in the workplace. Earlier this summer, I spoke with Diane Crawford on the topic. As a mother and spouse and someone who's experienced the challenges of both parenting and working during the pandemic, this topic is especially salient to me. And to really understand why the pandemic has been especially harmful, we must understand, quote, the default to responsibility, which author Brielle Valle describes as, quote, the cornerstone of gender inequity, the inequity that has permeated our homes and offices and remained there, billowing, growing in brawn. And now that it is exposed, knowledge and unity comprises its longevity. It is time for an eviction. And so for today's question, I'm asking, how do we cope with the current crisis of women's inequity in the workplace? And what can companies do to mitigate this in the future? To answer today's question, I'm joined by Brielle Valle. Brielle is a women's equity speaker and the owner of Brielle Valle Consulting, a leadership consulting firm focused on educating managers to achieve a cohesive and equitable culture. She has 15 years of experience in corporate development and people operations. Brielle holds a BS in communications, an MS in organizational communication and leadership, and is PI certified. Her recent research aims to support corporations in researching gender equity. Brielle, thank you so much for being here today. I loved your book. And I'm really excited to have you come in and unpack this term, default to responsibility. And I know that your book offers a lot of solutions for companies looking to mitigate this going forward. So I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. It's great to be here, and I've been looking forward to this conversation, undoubtedly. If we think about all that goes into default to responsibility, it's a broad stroke. It's not just one thing, it's an amalgamation of things. And my intent with this study, my intent with really identifying these different facets was focused on, let's try to understand our history, let's build upon what we know. And then when we are empowered with knowledge, we can change the future for our next generation.
So I'm interested in what sparked this. Obviously, this is super timely. You've pulled from history and you're sort of writing history as it happens as well. So I'd love to just hear how you started on this journey.
It was actually in March when the World Health Organization declared this global pandemic. And I was working at a corporation where I saw headcount reduction. I saw significant changes, chaos, for a lack of a better word. And it dawned on me that mothers were now going to be at home with their children. It dawned on me that at that time, I thought, okay, parents have this new reality that we've never faced before. And this inkling and this burning fear in my mind was, how is it when we remove the boundaries of workplace, remove the boundaries of childcare and any help? For example, if you were fortunate enough to have help within the home, whether that be childcare or cleaning support or lawn care, etc., what was that going to look like for women? So I started to not only read secondary research, as to your point, it was being unraveled, but really to say, I want to get a firsthand glimpse into this, because it's one thing to have an experiential moment with a woman who has shared her perspectives, and it's another to say, here's this person I don't know, and here's what we think is going on. So the motivation behind it was really to grasp the severity of the situation, the fact that it was not only timely, but it's unfortunately not time bound, meaning that our inequity has been built for many years, has really burnished in our lives in different ways, and how something so catastrophic as a pandemic would expose all of those elements that were in fact inequitable all along, but now we had a way to really shed light on it. So it was interest and concern.
So for those obviously who haven't read the book, but I'm sure hopefully will after this episode, could you just tell us about who you interviewed and how you sort of chose the participants?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the purpose of the study, and consequently why we now have this publication, is really to understand how the COVID-19 pandemic affected women's equality. Right. That was the goal. And I was able to interview 66 women through an ethnography methodology, which is essentially a qualitative framework. And for anybody who's interested, that means that you get to interview a lot of people. And so it was 66 women in this ethnographic study, and 27 questions were what were posed consistently across the board. And it was a snowball effect. So you'll see in the text, if you do read it, that there are some limitations with that, including who you have exposure to, who people know, because it is really rallying the troops of, I'm ready, able, and willing to hear your story. Are you ready, willing, and able to speak to me? And these women across the board were people who were working full-time. They were a variety of different ethnic backgrounds. And we also had people from all of the time zones in the United States. And we even were able to dabble in cross-border as well, between the UK and the US, which was an interesting element, because some of the practices, especially within corporate support for employees, look different in different countries.
In all your research, did you start with the idea that there was this idea of default to responsibility, or did this emerge from the research? And how did you sort of name this? I think it's a really fantastic phrase, and it really captures the plight of women during COVID. So I'd love to just have you talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, Melissa, it was interesting. This light bulb went off as I was compiling the primary data, as I was reading through my copious notes with these women. And it's this combination of what I was looking at from the historical perspective, right? I talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. I talk about women's rights and the evolution of that. But when we think about the work that was performed at scale, right, as industry grew, and the inception of, in my perspective, the inception of pay inequity actually occurred during that American Industrial Revolution. It's not that there weren't inequities, we can pick from many parts of history, but the ideal quote unquote America was one where men were providing, women at that time even, although they participated in this industry, were paid 1/3 to 1/2 of what a man was. And so at that point, there was this juncture of let's keep women at home, and immediately subjugated women to men based on power and money. So it was these foundational inequities that were really the building blocks to default to responsibility. And as you know, I have this very strong belief that it is a combination between in the home and at work, and we cannot separate the two, and we'll talk more about that. But that was kind of the inception of this idea. And then I went, how interesting, as we go through our talk here today, there were other elements that I extracted from the research, such as the concept of help and what that looks like in the home. And all of these things, I said, wow, women really fall back every single time to being the care provider, to making sure things are taken care of, to enabling a household. And that's amidst everything else that's happened. So the evolution of our lifetime has been, wow, women, quote unquote, can work now. Women can earn degrees now. Women can excel now. And it was a permission. So if we look at our mothers and our mothers' mothers, we consider all of the things that we now have that they did not, because they fought for it. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, actually, this is really interesting. We've done both. We have changed, we have evolved, we have excelled, but the things that were burnished early on have not shifted. We still ensure that our full-time career is overshadowed by a secondary full-time job. So I drew upon the concepts of second shift. I drew upon the concepts of really this laborious idea that I struggled with, especially in my lifetime when women can have it all. And I would pose the argument that we cannot have it all because we are doing more. Yep. And that will affect our mental health. That will affect the way that we progress into the future and the way that we raise our children. So many different pieces went into the naming of default to responsibility.
And so, I think a lot of us can imagine what this looks like. You mentioned that organizations have a real role to play in combating this default to responsibility. And so it'd be great to speak about what this looks like in the workplace. And then what do we do to as you mentioned, now that it's exposed, it's time to evict it. So I'd love to just hear about that a bit more.
Yeah, there's a big combination here. One is that we have to provide a reevaluation of benefits, and two is that we have to provide education. If we rethink division of labor and the interconnectivity of home and work life, we often separate those, and that topic can no longer be divided because one does permeate into the other. Unconscious bias, right? That this is your bread and butter, you're well familiar that it plays a huge role into this. Microaggressions against women in minimizing when they speak, being interrupted, or just simply dismissing their ideas and putting them into a box where they're going to have to overcome these additional hurdles within the workplace. And then corporations also have this immense opportunity to look at benefits, to look at parental leave, namely.
Yep.
There's a lot of research here about care and why children go to mothers first. That is not my born concept. This is something that has been read and studied, but it is all about access, right? Yeah. We seek out the person we know we are going to be able to get care from. And when mothers have maternity leave, guess what? They're getting that care primarily, and that continues forward. If fathers are afforded the same type of leave, that co-parenting construct is actually possible. And studies do show that just as oxytocin increases for women to create that bonding, the same thing happens for men. Mm-hmm. So this isn't some abstract idea of this isn't worthwhile. It absolutely is. And they've also found that children who have that bond with their fathers, it supports their physical, psychological health generally in their lifetime. So corporations need that knowledge, of course. They need to re-identify what their values are when it comes to families. And then I mentioned that education piece of managers across the board for my participants were the make it or break it for a woman's experience, and departures, which was a really significant piece of this as well, right? Women leaving the workforce. And I think that one of the things we need to consider here is if managers are adept in understanding empathy and understanding actually just general inclusion, then they have a better capability to not only fight for their people, but to push that messaging up to where it needs to come from, right? It has to go both ways, top down and down up. And that's where corporations have a real opportunity to implement processes across the board to support their employees.
Yeah, I thought that one, the focusing on benefits, the managers, and I think the other point that you make is that you're interested in also empowering men to be advocates. Absolutely. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that a bit more, because I know that was a really interesting. We talked about it also before, but also in the book is around sort of empowering men to be advocates. And so I know that this is an important point for you as well.
It is, yeah. And I think when we look at men and we're talking about a pool of people, right, that I interviewed, they were women. So of course, another limitation, I did not speak to men. I was not focusing on men. But in speaking with men, the observation of either a lacking of awareness of challenges because they've never worn those shoes, and the education that they haven't had for how they can support. So this is not a bashing of male dialogue. This is a men can actually be the igniters of change. Men's part in not only parenting, but in participation for advocacy of their partner, their wife, their colleague, calling out and saying, maybe that was her idea initially, or, you need to let her finish speaking first. Those are small little things we can do within the workforce. But then at home, it's a matter of what is mine to handle, right? I make this analogy in the text about a car, and it was the simplest framework that I could come up with for what we typically associate with a man. And, he wants to take care of his car. He owns the oil change, all of these different elements. And so what I'm saying is we must have more of that division. It's not all of this is yours and I have this one little thing. It's actually, let's look and assess who takes out the trash, or who does the vacuuming, or who does the planning for the vacations for the family, and dividing that equally. Because if you want your wife to be successful, if you want your daughters to be successful, if you want them to be able to provide for themselves, which anybody with I would say, a fair deduction in logic would say, yes, of course I want to advocate for that. We'll really have a different frame of mind when it comes to seeking out proactively equitability within the home and in the workplace.
Great teams fuel great business. In the office, on the road, in the field, and around the world, your people are working together to make it happen, to make something new, to do something better, to delight customers again and again. At Dialectic, we believe that even the best teams can get better. Dialectic is a learning company obsessed with helping teams reach their potential. Using person-centered, empathetic design and social science research methods, we build digital and in-person training that helps your people build habits that unlock enthusiastic collaboration and true belonging. For example, Learning Snippets is a diversity, equity, and inclusion micro-learning program that helps your people build inclusive habits in 3 minutes or less. Your team can practice living your organization's values with off-the-shelf programs like inclusive leadership, gender identity, or offsetting racial bias. Or let Dialectic design a solution tailored to your needs, from digital transformation and difficult conversations to disaster preparedness or design thinking. Learn more about how Dialectic could help unlock your team's potential at dialectic.solutions. And if you want to see how Learning Snippets puts DEI concepts into action, you'll find the link in the show notes. And now back to the show. So I think what I find really interesting is that while this is obviously this is a crisis that we will be recovering from for some time, there's an opportunity now, as you mentioned, having exposed really the places where women are most vulnerable in the workplace, to really now to start fill these gaps, so that, and I think you talk about this as being sort of crisis preparedness as well, right? So now, this showed all the cracks, but we actually now have an opportunity as we look forward and as we look to, whatever the new workplace is going to be, it's always changing, but to fill in these gaps so that we don't have the same sort of crisis. And it's around being prepared. But I'll let you speak to that a bit more.
Yeah, the preparation, I did draw out a concept that was crisis preparation and crisis recovery. And in that, one of the things that I was thinking about is how fascinating is it that some corporations looked at this as a pretty colossal issue and indicated that things needed to happen. So some employers offered additional 2 weeks of PTO for parents, some offered flex hours, some discussed the ability of really kind of dividing when they could do their work, if they could shift what type of their work they're doing just based on effort versus exposure to noise.
Yep.
And that's unfortunately the rarity. The majority of these corporations said business as usual, hunker down, you can work more hours, you have more bandwidth now, you're working from home. And in this ideal state, right, from a perspective of capitalism, we say, wow, that's great. We're attached to our devices. In a perspective of a mother, she was being scorned at for having children on her camera. A husband was oftentimes, again, from my participants' experience, removed to a different space. And some of these women posed really interesting questions, a couple of which even to HR, saying, how am I supposed to eat myself, not to mention feed my children, and what resources are provided? And many HR professionals indicated that's not our problem, right? Our home is not the office. Your home is not our office. So one of the things with that crisis preparation and crisis recovery is obviously facing the issue at hand. I'm a big believer in inquisition of what people need. And my research, as well as others, support the finding that people, families, really wanted flex hours or more time off or better family leave plans versus anything to do with compensation or snacks in the office or a lot of these ancillary things that are less important to them. So you need to seek out answers first from the employees. I also suggest that we need to implement a gender equity steering committee within corporations. So really fueling off that employee feedback, right? How are we prioritizing our needs? How are we looking at creating a model for the indispensability of diversity and how all of those pieces really go together? We need women's voices in that. And of course, I mentioned the evaluation of benefits and the parental leave, but that training piece is really essential too, because people don't know how to deal with trauma. And why would you, right? That if you've been fortunate enough to either not experience it yourself or your education is in something far from that. So that type of offering to employees is essential. And that crisis preparation piece, I would say that if in fact you're able to look at anything and have an underlying tone of adaptability and agility, you can change the reality for your workers. And now 2 million or even over 2 million women would still be at work because they didn't feel like they were forced out. They would be supported. And it's costly to replace employees. It's very costly. So corporations were actually shooting themselves in the foot. And all the while we're, the building blocks of this ladder we've been climbing have been crumbling. And now we're like, okay, we have a rock.
Yep.
How do we not only get back in there, but how do we ensure that these overarching procedures are in place so that it doesn't crumble again?
It's such a really fascinating topic. And as I mentioned, like I had read a ton of different studies, reports, there's the McKinsey report and there's lots of reports, but I really thought contextualizing the current plight of women within the historical context, within this broader research really brought home where we are today. And I love that, not only did you sort of say, okay, this is the problem, but you offered concrete solutions as well, which I think is super helpful and things that are born out of the research, but also talking to women, which is, as you mentioned, say this all the time, talk to the employees because they will tell you what they need and they will tell you if what you think you're doing is working, right? And I think the thing that, as you mentioned, managers too, is being able to advocate for employees is so important as well. And as you said, whether women chose to stay or to leave really depended upon that manager as well. And I know that managers is an area where you specialize and focus on as well, because they're often caught in the middle between just from above and also having to be on working with employees and ensuring that work gets done and that employee relations are going well. Brielle, I want to thank you so much. I could sit here and talk to you about this all day, but I want to allow folks the opportunity to read Brielle's publication. We will be posting a link to it on the show notes. I want to thank you so much, Brielle, for sharing your insights today. And for everyone who's tuned in, if you're interested in learning more about Brielle's work, you can follow her on LinkedIn, and we will have her LinkedIn handle as well on the show notes. To everyone else, thank you so much for joining me on Just One Q. If you have any of your own burning questions, please feel free to reach out to me at hello@learningsnippets.ca, or you can write us a review to let us know what you thought of today's episode. Until next time, I'm Dr. Melissa Horn, and this has been Just One Q.